Hello everybody. I am again in the San Francisco Botanical Gardens, my favorite place to make videos. Unfortunately, it means that, at least for part of my time here, I'm going to be holding an electronic device in my hand and paying attention to both that and thoughts while I'm walking in the gardens. I've just finished cleaning some spider webs away from the opening to the beehive in the great entrance cypress tree. Glad to see that hive is active again, and there are a number of spiders that take advantage of the fact that the hive is active and also that it's not particularly well populated. I had to find some bamboo and break a branch of bamboo, not from a branch that had already fallen, in order to make a broom with which to sweep away some of the spider webs surrounding the hive's entrance. And it's not that I think the spiders shouldn't have access to the bees. Spiders and bees have been contending with one another for a very long time. And in fact, other members of the Hymenoptera family, particularly wasps, are very adept at hunting spiders. However, the bees are neither adept at hunting them nor at defending themselves from them. I have just accidentally located a spot where none of these things may seem relevant, but to the topic I'm going to pursue, which is actually going to be an extension of my recent video on dreaming. I've also just located a spot, and this is a little confusing, but it looks like, let's see here, let's see if I can show you this. It looks like that branch right there of this tree, that is one of the preferred places that a relatively large raptor has been using at some point in the not too distant past, either as a perch or for digestive purposes. It's conceivable there's a nest up there, but the reason that I know that is because of this. I can't see what the camera is seeing right now, so I'm just going to move it back and forth across the remains of that object we ordinarily refer to as an owl pellet or a raptor pellet. And these are the remains of very large, and this one's well decomposed, but these are the remains of very large pellets. So I suspect, sorry for the shaking there, just brushing something off the camera. I suspect there's a relatively large raptor nearby. And I'm just going to look around briefly for other pellets, but those two are pretty big, so there's a nice kind of lemony scent near here. Not sure what's producing it. Many of the best pellets if one is trying to collect them, which very few people do, are often hidden in the grass or brush at the base of these trees. So it's difficult to find a large intact pellet. One has to find it fairly, it should be fairly fresh. Otherwise they tend to fall apart as they get watered and sprinkled on and so on. So today I'm going to be talking much more deeply about what we call dreaming. And one of the problems here is that our nomenclature is very deceptive. When we make words, we use them in a sense. Now, of course, once I'm talking about the complexities of language in language, I'm really in trouble, but I'm going to attempt to mitigate the difficulties as best as I can, as skillfully as I can. So when we make a word, if we imagine the sum total of possible experiences, or of things that can be experienced, words are delineations of that manifold. In other words, a manifold, this word can be used in various ways, but I'm thinking of a bubble made of many bubbles, such that it forms a superbubble. And at the top of human reference chains is what I would call a uniphore, a single term that refers to all things. And one of the common uniphores is reality, which we would imagine can refer to all possible phenomena, including cognitive phenomena, even though we might differentiate things we think from things which exist. Yeah? And yet thoughts exist. So thoughts are within the realm of everything. Everything is another common uniphore. And the universe is another common uniphore. These refer to the uppermost level token in the tree of tokens that our languages comprise. And as you go down that tree, what you find are delineations, places where we've made cuts. And we've done that on purpose. And the cuts are not themselves explicit. In other words, only someone who wanted to would differentiate a tree from the land, or this place, right? Or a stone, or a pool, or the beehive, or the spider. So we make these cuts, and in each language, the cuts have resemblances to one another, but have differences in what they denote, what they explicitly point at, and what they connote, what their associations are. So in the game of language, we have tokens, trees of tokens, right? I would say we have uniphores, then we have holophores, which are very important distinctions, such as the world, the sun, food, mother, a friend, dreaming, consciousness, our hand, an eye, animal, plant. These are elements that we need to have tokens for and understand something about them in order to understand anything else, because holophores, how shall I put it, invest their properties in subtokens, so that if you think, for example, that the universe is the quote-unquote creation, or the natural result or expression of a divine being or universe, then all things inherit that property, right? So everything inherits the properties that we associate with the uniphore. If we think that the universe is a mechanically, it's an accident of uninhabited mechanics, then everything acquires that property. In other words, nothing is not uninhabited mechanics because the universe has that quality. And similarly, to understand what an animal is, or a plant, or an organism, we generally will know something about what the everything is. And the everything may be the holophore of the world, right? What the world is. What is the world? It's a planet in space. This is terrestrial life. These are terrestrial life forms, and so on and so forth. They inherit the properties that we associate with the planet. But there's all kinds of holophores. We need to know, for example, maybe two of the most fundamental holophores, and some of them are bipolar or multipolar like this, are separate and unified, right? Because in order to have the idea of any distinct thing that has been delineated, we must have some idea or sense of what it means to be separate, to be distinct. And so perhaps unity and separation are the fundamental, maybe the most fundamental bipolar holophores. And there isn't an explicit list of holophores, nor do I really think there should be. I can name a variety of them, 12 to 15, at will. I'll probably name a different list every time, but it'll contain some similar elements that I've used in other lists. And the term holophore is a neologism, a new word, that I invented when I was thinking very deeply about the structure of human relationships with language. And by the way, I am what might be called a Whorfian, although I wouldn't use that description normally, in that I believe, at least, that our relationships with language transform our expectations and our experiences of being human, of seeing, of relating with, of understanding, of noticing. So with a different lexicon, we will notice different things. With different connotations, those things will have different meanings. With different denotations, they will obviously have different identities in consciousness. And equivalencies, right? They will be like or unlike, well, equivalency might be the wrong word, resemblances. They will be like or unlike other things. It's said that the strong version of the Whorf hypothesis has been completely refuted or defeated. Whether or not that is actually true, I still am certain that at least our relationships with language, how we use it, how we understand its own anatomy and function and potentials, deeply affect our experiences, understandings, noticings, the way we make analogies or resemblances or metaphors, and so the very nature of our representational cognition. And part of why that's important, and why I'm using this as a preface, is that I'm talking about dreaming. And this word dream is used in English primarily to refer to what I will actually call an experience of non-ordinary cognition, because I'll refer to waking consciousness as ordinary cognition for the moment, even though I may choose to invert that polarity later and say that it's actually the dreaming consciousness that has precedence, and that waking consciousness is a subset of dreaming. It's a specific how shall I put this? It's a specifically structured sub-aspect of what would otherwise be dreaming consciousness. And I think it's an aspect we learn to sustain as we mature from childhood to produce what is generally understood by adults primarily as waking consciousness, because children have a very different experience of waking consciousness than adults do. And this is evidenced by their absolute fascination with play, and even with what we call toys. And playing. So we have these delineations in language, in English. We have being awake, right? As we may suppose I am now. We have being asleep. Huh? And then I can say, the waking mind to refer to the common properties that are familiar to me, and there are many available properties that are not familiar to me. In fact, we might say most of the available properties of the waking mind are not familiar to me. I have managed to become acquainted with a very small subset of those properties, or faculties is a better word. Yes, I like that word much better. So there's an incredible array of faculties that are available to us within waking consciousness. Most of us will have an incredibly modest exposure to those faculties, and that exposure will be delineated partly by language, partly by culture, partly by heritage, partly by experience, so on and so forth. I'm going to pause briefly while people pass me. So I want you to imagine thousands of faculties that are available to waking consciousness, and to realize that we are likely to become familiar with only a very small fraction of those. And that's primarily because of what we're told to expect and what is modeled to us by adults and authorities, scientists, theorists, religious authorities, so on and so forth. But I know for certain that there are essentially an unlimited number of faculties available to the waking mind. And I know for certain that for most of us, the reason I know this is I've had some brief experience of something else. I've had brief experience of that very narrow window of waking consciousness faculties suddenly widening dramatically beyond anything I ever imagined possible. And that experience is still somewhat inexplicable to me, though I could compare it with various ideas, such as direct contact with a non-human intelligence. That's the one I prefer, because that's the one that most resembles the experiences that I had, and still occasionally have, but usually to a much more modest degree. So there's a vast array of faculties available to waking consciousness, and most of us are going to have a very limited exposure to those faculties. Similarly, there are a vast array, perhaps an infinite array of faculties available and normal to our dreaming consciousness, and again, most of us are going to have a very limited exposure to those faculties, experience of them, knowledge of them, firsthand or even theoretical. So in common English, we have a few terms that relate to dreaming consciousness. We have the ordinary dream. We have hypnagogic experience, which is experiences often involving what we call hallucinations that occur between being awake and falling asleep. We have the post-hypnagogic dreaming, right, which is the dreams that we have before we enter deep sleep. And then we have the pre-hypnopompic dreaming, the dreams we have before transiting from sleep to wakefulness. We have hypnopompic experience, which is the experience in between. Ordinarily, we don't have a lot of hypnagogic or hypnopompic experiences, but the betweens, right? from waking to sleep and sleep to waking, these are sort of bridge domains in which extremely unusual phenomena can occur that are often seem very bizarre, are hallucinogenic, perhaps are psychogenic, and so forth. And by the way, psychogenic means psyche generating, and psygenic is a word I use to mean mind making. But there's another. I think there's an actual term for generating states of consciousness. Now, of course, these are the cuts we have made, and people who made different cuts will have wildly different ideas, and because they'll have different ideas, they will notice, be curious about, perceive, pursue, reject, embrace phenomenon. Yeah? So language makes a difference. There's no way around it. It has to. Because associated with language are meanings and values and evaluations, so that for a given sociocultural people, certain phenomenon will be sought after and desired. Other phenomenon will be fled from, repressed, seen as undesirable. And this will often have to do with a value system that underlies the languages and is associated with the tokens, the delineations, the cuts in the manifold of all that is, that have been made by those people. And all those cuts are made for purposes. So the language matters, it turns out. Whether or not we can prove or disprove Worf's hypotheses, or the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis set, or the strong or weak versions, that's irrelevant. Well, it's not irrelevant, but it doesn't answer the question, right? And the fact that I'm just stating this, I'm just asserting that the language matters, doesn't make it true. Obviously, you'll have to, just like we all do, you'll have to decide for yourself, hopefully through experiment and exploration, whether what I'm saying here makes sense and is accessible to your own direct experience of cognition. Certainly, if I call this a tree, this gal, this being, this possibly non-gendered thing. And by the way, all the controversy around gendered pronouns is related to the fact that language matters. Yeah? In that particular domain, which I'm not going to dwell on or deeply delve into, it appears that some segment of our population has become extremely concerned with the denotations and connotations of gender pronouns. And that's because they feel, well, I can't say exactly why that is actually. It's very complex, this story, and it's not an easy thing to delineate. Yeah, it's not an easy thing to draw a circle around and resolve. Oh, there's a woodpecker up here. Now, if I call that a woodpecker, that has certain associations and connotations. It doesn't really matter a lot if I just change it to a nonsense word like a nobofred. Yeah, a nobofred. Because that term has it doesn't belong to a language, right? So it doesn't acquire the meaning elements that are inside phonemes or even single letters or sounds. Because sounds themselves are meaningful to human beings. The sounds made by our letters are very meaningful. And the vocal sounds we make have a kind of visceral sensibility to us. Yeah? So it matters if the sounds are different, but it doesn't help me to simply change the word tree into a nonsense word, because that word will stand alone. It'll be almost a kind of super neologism, right? A word that, although in making neologisms we will tend to incorporate aspects of our native language, unless we're trying to invent a word in one of our non-native languages, presuming we have some. And a speaker who knows many languages is really living in a different world of identity than someone who only knows one, because a speaker who knows more than one language can triangulate on identity from multiple positions in a linguistic structure, whereas somebody who knows only a single language is trapped with that single structure. And you might think, well, what does all this have to do with dreaming? And that's a very reasonable thing to think, because I'm thinking it right now. But it has a lot to do with dreaming if the waking mind and our representational faculties were forged and informed by experiences of dreaming. And for me, that relationship seems very, very likely. Even if they were not only forged by our experiences of dreaming, they were deeply influenced by them. The linguistic emerges from the non-linguistic, from the pre-linguistic, in my view, and is deeply related to that which cannot be spoken. But the reason that I'm concerned with these cuts that we make to produce tokens like waking and dreaming and consciousness is because I want to draw into question the scope of dreaming. And the way that I want to draw it into question is by suggesting that the scope is very broad and actually encompasses waking consciousness, though most of us will remain unaware of that during our lifetimes, primarily because the models that we have of waking consciousness explicitly exclude dreaming, and the experiences that we have of waking consciousness seem to be not like dreaming. And what waking consciousness can ordinarily conserve from our dreaming experience is a very modest segment at best, or very modest produce. Essentially, most of us can only conserve a plot. And a plot is a kind of this happened, then that happened, then this happened, linear structure that is easily communicated in language and yet does not communicate most of what actually is going on in dreaming experience. So we have in English a variety of things we can talk about commonly in dreaming. These include hypnopompic and hypnagogic phenomenon. Excuse me, got that backwards. I'll go from waking to sleep and sleep to waking. So hypnagogic and hypnopompic phenomenon. What we refer to as lucid dreaming, which is the usually relatively gentle intrusion of aspects of waking consciousness into what I'll call the dreaming manifold or the dream experience. And lucid dreaming is a way that our waking consciousness can participate somewhat directly in dreaming experience without causing it to collapse into waking. Most of the time, when we begin to have some concern with our waking mind in a dream, for many of us anyway, what happens is we awaken, right? The intrusion of waking concerns or questions about even the history of a specific dreaming experience, like how did I come to be in a room that is not my room and yet is my room, right? Or why does this person who looks nothing like my sister, why is that person actually my sister? And I know her to be my sister, or even him to be my sister, even though it doesn't look like my sister, right? One might we can have experiences of identity and dreaming that are radically different from those we are accustomed to in our waking minds. And the dreaming mind sees, in general, little or no conflict. It might notice that something's a little unusual, right? If my sister is a boy in my dream. But it won't collapse by itself. The waking mind's concerns have to enter into the situation for there to be the collapse, as I understand it, for the dream to collapse toward waking. The waking mind's concerns and intelligences have to intrude upon the dreaming situation. I think it would be really amazing if we could do the opposite thing, if we could experience lucid waking or translucid waking, which would be the subtle intrusion of dreaming phenomenon into our waking consciousness without collapsing it into a dream. That would be really something. And this is part of what I think people are after when they're using psychedelic drugs. And that may be one of the ways to have something that at least resembles that experience. But I think it's problematic in a variety of ways. There is a resemblance, but there is not an equivalence. We don't use drugs, and need no drugs, to experience lucid dreaming. And there is no drug you can take that I'm aware of, though there are a few that have been suggested. I know a couple of them. It's been so long since I've thought about this topic that I may not be able to name them at the moment. But there are a couple of herbs. One produces a very bitter tea that at least are reputed to facilitate lucid dreaming. So again, hypnagogic phenomenon, dreaming itself, hypnopompic phenomenon, lucid dreaming, and what? Let's see. Oh, then we have what is referred to as astral travel, or OBEs, out-of-body experiences. Now it should be clear that the phrase lucid dreaming encompasses a range of phenomenon, and so too the phrase astral travel. These encompass a range of phenomenon. One of the peculiar I guess it would be difficult to say whether this is an aspect of dreaming or of trained imagination. But the phenomenon referred to as remote viewing, a phenomenon many people would be skeptical of, but I am not particularly skeptical about, because I both experienced it and experienced it being done. This is a radical transformation. This is one of the waking faculties that I'm claiming are available to us that we would not ordinarily have experience of. And again, I think there are thousands of these. So in English, we have waking, dreaming, hypnagogia, hypnopompia, astral travel, lucid dreaming, and then maybe a few other words like visions. And again, the phrases astral travel, lucid dreaming, and visions, the word visions, these refer to a broad range of phenomena, not simply one. And so too does the word dreaming. So that there are many different forms of dreaming, many flavors, many kinds. But in English, we do not really have, we've not made many distinctions. We pretty much just have dreams and nightmares. Lucid dreams, astral travel. Perhaps we might include precognitive dreams. Again, something some people are skeptical about, but that I have good reason to believe actually happens to people. In fact, there was an example of it yesterday where a man had a dream about his friend, in which his friend was very frightened by a dog that had bit his friend in childhood when they were in real life. And he had a dream that he was again with his friend as an adult, and this dog came. And the man was very frightened of the dog. And he had this dream, and the next day, the man in that dream was found to be dead in his house. Now that's not a direct precognitive dream. The dreamer did not dream that the man died the next day and would be found in his house. But he had a dream that something was badly wrong, and that the man was very frightened. And the dream stuck out in his consciousness, and he remembered it. So I very much believe that dreaming connects us to a non-ordinary cognitium, a network of minds, and not all of those minds are human. We might have difficulty understanding or believing in the existence of non-human minds. And by this I mean particularly minds that are not embodied as organisms. I don't think we have too much trouble believing, for example, that a cat or a dog has something resembling a mind, and even a personality. I found this to be much more prevalent in my own experience of living things and beings and living places than regular quote-unquote people would imagine. So that to me, plants and even insects demonstrate aspects that resemble mindedness and or personality, particularly certain kinds of insects. Well, it's much more recognizable in certain kinds. It's much easier for humans to recognize in certain kinds of animals and insects than it is in others. And that's because we associate certain qualities with mindedness, and many of those are suggested to us by our language. So that it is easier for us to perceive something analogous to mindedness or consciousness, character, or personality in animals like cats or dogs or chimps or gorillas or dolphins than it is, for example, in bees or houseflies or ants. But as someone who has spent a great deal of time with insects, I assure you that it is at least true to my own experience that each insect is an individual organism in the sense that it has unique characteristics local to that organism that are expressions of its unique biology, history, experience, perhaps analogs of emotion, and so on and so forth. One can see houseflies contesting over terrain very violently, and just as other animals do, after the contest they preen, right? And that's not merely... Well, here we come to the idea of instinct, which is a hugely problematical nightmare. But it's not merely instinctual. Each animal preens somewhat differently and for different purposes and with slightly different outcomes. So I've birdwalked somewhat here, but what I want to suggest is that there are cognitia, networks of minds, and that different organisms compose cognitia together, and they also compose social cognitia, such as a beehive or the city of San Francisco or the state of California or the United States or the Northwest Hemisphere or the world. There is a human cognitium, there's a cognitium of bears, there is the cognitium of dogs, and these are cuts in the universal network of minds, in the metacognitium that all beings, probably in all of time and space, compose or comprise together. It's going to be a little noisy here for a moment, so I'm walking next to the street. And the cognitium of drivers is different from the cognitium of people who are walking, right? We can make all kinds of different distinctions. But what I want to suggest is that dreaming, one of the things that's going on in dreaming is that we are connecting with, transmitting to, that is to inform or instructure, and receiving from, that is to become informed or instructured, the cognitia of other beings, and possibly not just other beings, but in other dimensions of time and or space, in other places. And some of those beings are transhuman. They are intelligences that are vastly more significant to ours, vastly superior to ours. They are intelligences that we might ordinarily think of as supernatural, although that's a little bit confused since nature is a uniphore, right? It refers to all that is. And for something to be supernatural, it would have to be beyond that which is. It could be supernatural in the sense that it transcends locality, right? And most of our experiences of nature are localized, at least in time. We think of the past as inaccessible and the future as inaccessible. But I believe that's not the fact of our cognition or our humanity. I think it's actually more a fact of our habituated perspective in time. And the reason I think that is, again, I've had experience of non-local temporal awareness. So it seems to me that human minds, particularly when aided by an outside satellite, can escape many of the boundaries that we would ordinarily associate with what is knowable by a human being, that we would ordinarily believe to delineate what is knowable by a human being. Now, lots of other things are going on in dreaming. This worm is getting dried out, and that's not good. Let's see if I can somehow be of assistance with this animal. So, I've just had contact with a non-human organism, physical contact. I've acquired some of its commensal bacteria on my fingers, and it's acquired some of mine. Hopefully, that will have a good outcome for the animal that I was attempting to assist. That's not always guaranteed. Humans are missing crucial domains of awareness when we interact with living communities or organisms. And what seems, good to us can be absolutely catastrophic to organisms. This was a very painful thing that I discovered in my childhood because I was too naive. My ideas of what constituted the good for me and some organism were often catastrophically misfounded in sort of fairy tales. And it doesn't necessarily help to have science. A good example is that the Department of Fish and Game was contacted at some point to license an indigenous group to hunt buffalo, a traditional symbiotic relationship. And the scientists in the Department of Fish and Game told the indigenous hunters they would grant the license, but they had to hunt only the oldest bulls. The herds from which those bulls were hunted died. And the reason they died is that the oldest bulls are the ones that cut through the snow and ice for the herd when conditions become very harsh. And so the Fish and Game people were thinking what they imagined to be rational thoughts. The oldest bulls can't reproduce anymore. They're essentially disposable. They also aren't very good at protecting the herd, but that's not really true. So rationality can be misfounded, and we can have the wrong idea about what constitutes goodness in a relationship with organisms, primarily because our conceptual awareness is insufficient to encompass the actual situation or relationship. Yeah? Perhaps with our dreaming mind, we might have better luck if our dreaming mind were somehow involved. At least if the scope of our relational and organismal awareness were expanded, and perhaps our conceptual awareness slightly reduced so that it wouldn't dominate that organismal awareness, we might be able to make better choices in understanding how humans can relate with living beings and places in a way that is healthy and mutually beneficial. And perhaps for us cognitively beneficial, because it would nourish aspects and faculties of waking consciousness that we are either deprived of, or we have broken versions of them. I've had a wide variety of dreaming experience, but that's not by any stretch of the imagination to claim that I've glimpsed the scope of the possibilities. I haven't. I simply have had a variety of staggeringly surprising experiences, and have spoken with others who've had experiences as well, that early on convinced me that what we are taught to think about dreaming is not true, and is far too narrow to be useful. I had non-ordinary experiences as a child. My mom would say, "Oh, you were just dreaming." I would try to explain to her, "No, Mom, this wasn't a dream." She was concerned that if I became too fascinated by these experiences and phenomenon that I might go mad. She was concerned for my sanity. Apparently she was aware that madness was a factor in our family history. And she herself would undergo, through her life later, profound and disruptive experiences of non-ordinary cognition that definitely did not seem to be healthy, right? It wasn't as though she was drawing new insights and intelligence from these experiences. Rather, she was what we would usually call delusional. And this factor is relevant in my family tree. Although the forces, the same catalysts that emerge as madness in one mind can conceivably emerge as prodigy in another mind, a mind capable of managing the staggeringly profound momentum of non-ordinary cognition and non-ordinary cognitive phenomenon, such as those that result in mania, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder, autism, etc. The things that we think of as mental illness, or in newer language, neurodiversity. So I am suggesting that under some circumstances, the same catalysts that would produce psychosis in one individual might produce prodigy in another. And I suggest this based upon direct experience of something that bordered on psychosis, but I was able to manage and produce otherwise unimaginable insight from over a long period of time. This too is related to dreaming. Schizophrenia, mania, autism, all of these things, the nature of consciousness, its understructure is deeply and profoundly related to dreaming. Oh, that's interesting. Just do not proceed beyond this point. Danger, but no, it doesn't say what of. What is the danger? So here's a sign and someone has broken off the part that says, oh, I see what it is. Okay. The danger is the branches of these trees often break and fall. So they don't want people to proceed beyond this little barrier. You know, we've been told, that's like what my mom was saying when she was telling me as a child, when I'd had, for example, an out-of-body experience, that I was only dreaming. Or when I had a really profound hypnagogic hallucination, that it was just a dream. It wasn't just a dream. And I was not merely dreaming. And the idea that dreaming is a mere phenomenon is the kind of absurd and backwards perspective we get from the relatively isolated island of waking consciousness as we ordinarily experience it. Now, it is apparent that some people have very likely discovered some of the faculties that we moderns have no experience or idea of. And by the way, once we realize that we're aware of only a very limited array of the faculties natural to our waking consciousness or accessible to our waking consciousness, once we become aware of that, and I want to caution people against using drugs for this exploration. There's a wide number of reasons why I would make that caution. But once we become aware of that, we become capable of trailblazing. We become capable of forging new terrain, and not merely for ourselves, but terrain that can be shared with others. We can discover new faculties that we can teach others how to discover. We can blaze trails that others can later follow and expand on. We can recover to our waking experience faculties of intelligence and consciousness, sensitivities, senses that have for thousands of years lain dormant in our people. And it is my hope that we will do this together. And it's my hope that my own work may inspire this kind of exploration. The reason that I will caution against drugs is a similar reason that I would caution against using drugs to facilitate the acquisition of dreaming faculties. Drugs interfere with our metabolism dramatically, and they can damage or suggest faculties that don't exist. They can produce simulations of experience that are neither realistic, coherent, nor useful. Although I've heard thousands of people claim, that psychedelics is the doorway to awakening and enlightenment and so on and so forth, I've seen nearly no examples of that. I'm not saying there aren't any. I'm saying of the thousands of people that I've seen, raving about the powers of psychedelics, not one of them has brought to me any specifically communicable insight that is useful and transmissible in our waking world consciousness. And so, I'm not saying that there are no instances of that phenomenon of the acquisition of useful intelligence or transmissible insight, only that it's unimaginably rare compared to the wild claims of, awakening, which I just not seeing the evidence of that. I've also seen many minds irreparably damaged or destroyed by exposure to drugs. And the simple fact is, we don't need them, right? Our consciousness is capable of changing its shape, so to speak. It's the analogy of shape. And when that shape changes, our perceptions change, right? And this is one of the things we can learn from our experience of psychedelic drugs that's useful if we will pursue it without them, right? If we will pursue the disciplines that allow us to change the shape and sort of resonance of our waking world consciousness, we will discover new faculties. For example, there are indigenous people who, in their culture, it is said that they have dream seers who can actually see what another person has dreamt. They can see the sequence of images, at least, and interpret it. Now, to see the sequence of images is not the same as seeing a dream, because in a dream, identity has extra dimensions of meaning and connotation and suggestion. And this is one of the really profound things about dreaming, is that in the world of a dream, the nature of identity is radically transformed. And the necessity for matching with waking world identity dissolves. It's not there. Such that my sister can be a man. And there are maybe in the waking world they are subtracted or something. Our experience of identity becomes imbued with astonishing depth and domains of meaning and connotation and character and implication and suggestion and so on. And in our waking world, by the way, the child has something of this in their experience of play. Yeah? So when children are playing, what they're actually doing is investing their physical experience with the kinds of extra dimensions of meaning and character and circumstance that a dreaming mind does, but they're able to do it while they're awake. And we it is claimed that we grow out of this. That's not what happens. What happens is it gets buried under layers and layers of normalization, representational cognition, and the loss of dimensions of meaning, identity, character, circumstance, relationship, that is the result primarily of our exposure to formal representational cognition, language, and culture. And over time, what happens is that repeated instructuring buries the faculties that children use to play, that they employ in play. And so too, for those of us especially who are not artists or have, powerful creative outlets, we lose fundamental aspects of our relationship with imagination. And when that happens, there are profound repercussions psychologically, metabolically, in our character, so on and so forth. So it is said that in some cultures there are people who have practiced the art, who have acquired and practiced the art of seeing into the dreams of another after they have had them. Now, certainly we must imagine that the people who have had dreams can remember some of their dreams, and thus would know if the dream seer was able to actually do this or not, right? And although the dream seer might see into dreams the dreamer could not remember, they would also see into dreams that the dreamer could remember, and thus the faculty could be validated. Now, I recently had a very astonishing experience where I had had some very important, unusual dreams and a nightmare. And later that day, I was very excited to meet a body of living water, which I will not name, and whose name I do not know, because the human name of this body of water is not that body's name. It's just what the humans call it. And when I got in the water of the lake, it was very cold at first, and I was expecting that. Well, very cold is relative. It wasn't freezing, but it was quite chilly. And after 2 or 3 minutes of adjusting to the temperature and becoming comfortable with it, suddenly 2 things happened. I began to re-dream dreams I had had the night before, including dreams I had not recollected upon awakening. And I felt this incredible, powerful living pulse of something I don't know what to call it other than the essence of dreaming. As if this body of water were filled with this essence, and it awoke that essence in me, caused me to re-dream dreams I had the night before, and filled me with this profound, astonishing sense of non-ordinary awareness. And this is what I mean when I say we don't need drugs for this. Yeah? And drugs can damage or interfere or wrong foot us, right? They can put us on the wrong path. I think our natural faculties are much more trustworthy than the experiences we would ordinarily have when we introduce drugs. I'm not trying to tell other people what to do. I'm simply being honest about my own experience and concerns. I want people to have direct conscious experience of non-ordinary cognition and consciousness, awareness and faculties without being intoxicated. And then, if they've then had that experience and they want to experiment briefly with drugs, I'm a little more open to that. But I think there's a lot more damage that ensues than there is progress from most of that behavior. And so I'm highly skeptical of it. And I have had both kinds of experience, right? I've had non-ordinary experience that was essentially imposed by drug use, the use of psychedelics of various kinds. And then I've had non-ordinary experience that was natural to my waking state consciousness, not imposed by drug use. And the latter was, 1,000-fold deeper than anything that even very powerful psychedelic drugs ever got close to. So it's not only that, not all of my non-ordinary waking world experience that wasn't associated with intoxicants was super powerful. Some of it was very subtle and gentle, but some of it was so staggeringly overwhelming that I could barely survive it. I want people to have the experiences that are available to them with their natural bodies and consciousness and metabolism before they are exposed to the imposed non-ordinary cognition of psychedelics, so that they can tell the difference, right? And so that psychedelics doesn't get there first, and thus predispose them to expect kinds of things or to look for certain forms of experience that actually don't matter. They're not particularly important or even useful. They're just exotic, right? And there's lots of phenomena like that in the world, right? There's lots of phenomena that's super exotic, but it's not very useful or healthy to engage in. It doesn't get us anywhere, yeah? And if we can become addicted to that kind of thing. We can become addicted to the spectacle, to the shiny, surprising, seemingly novel stuff. And in so doing, we can overlook the fundamentally, crucially important insights and clues and motivations that would otherwise lead us to success. So these are some of my concerns about that. But it does seem clear that dreaming suggests an array of non-ordinary faculties. And in many cultures, dreaming is associated with either the soul. Again, where do you make the cut, right? Some cultures will say there are 9 different souls associated with your body. Some will say there are 37. Some will say there are 10, right? Some will say 3. But dreaming is associated in almost every culture with phenomenon that in English we would refer to as either metaphysical or spiritual. I think the cuts we've made in English are very crude, and we should be cautious about them, right? The delineations we've made in English are insufficient to properly expose us and motivate us for exploration. So we can use them, but we should recognize how incredibly limited they are and how limiting they can be if we believe them to be sufficient or complete, so on and so forth. And it's not necessarily a fact that we need new language, although new language sometimes can be useful. It's just that I want us to see that the narrow delineations that we have in English are the result of cultural models and knowledge traditions that are unfriendly to non-ordinary experience, that are essentially domineering in that they want to dictate the identity and the nature of possibility, our faculties, so on and so forth. And we should resist that, right? We should see through that. At first, we will explore where there is no language to help us yet. As we seek the faculties, senses, and forms of awareness that our unimaginably sophisticated gift of human incarnation brings with us. And it's really tragic. I think, in the West, us moderns, maybe around the world, we're dying inside because the light that nourishes our human hearts and consciousness and awareness has been dimming for thousands of years as these faculties have fallen away, as these experiences and traditions have disappeared and been replaced by representations that are essentially like plastic dolls compared to what they represent. And many of our modern religions have this unfortunate status, yeah? Whatever they might have originally referred to is gone from our experience, and so all that's left is this sort of domineering representation that's contagious as all hell, but relatively ignorant, and maybe even lethally toxic. And that's very unfortunate. However, this is part of the problem with our human relationship with representational consciousness, and particularly with formal representational cognition. That is, the inclination to encode identity in tokens, trees of tokens, and relationships that are insufficient to even point toward the identities thus encoded, and over time continue to degrade in a fashion that resembles lossy compression in computing terms. If you take something, like if you take a video and you compress it in a lossy way, right, where you're going to lose half the data in the compression, and then compress it again in a way where you're going to lose 3/4 of the data, and then keep doing something like that, eventually you get just a mangled mess of nothing. There's no data left, right? And pretty short order too. And this is one of the problems with our relationship with representational cognition and with what Korzybski would call time binding, Alfred Korzybski, the author of Science and Sanity, which is the inclination to pass on traditional models, concepts, and tokens generation to generation. There's a woodpecker, again, a different one, I think. Though I've noticed one in this vicinity for the past few days, and I suspect we must be approaching mating season for these creatures in this, where I live. So this is part of the problem with representational cognition over time, and particularly, it's unfortunate, but both science and religion have deeply contributed to the lossy aspect of our relationship with concepts, ideas, identity, names, characteristics, dimensions of character, functions and dimensions of functions. These have been crushed down to an incredibly narrow and uninhabitable array of reference as time has progressed. Time binding is the passing on to generation to each new generation of the well, of some portion of the previously conserved knowledge of ancestral peoples. So for an example, a friend of mine who is an indigenous man is involved in indigenous ceremonial activity, and he told me that one of the people who taught the younger generation some of the ceremonial songs was so old that he could barely sing. And since this was the only person the young men could learn the songs from, they learned to sing them. The only way you can really learn is to emulate them. They learned to sing them like an old man who can barely sing. And someone who actually knows the songs cannot sing with these people, because one cannot even understand the words that are in the songs. They are mangled, and the young men are singing like an exhausted old man because they're emulating him. Whereas the songs should have like this vitality in them, this sort of pulsing vitality that's necessary to move to change the shape of our consciousness, right? And this is one of the techniques. I won't call it a technology because I don't see it as that. It's something very unusual. It has features of function and identity that we don't have language for in waking consciousness. You know, we might say it's supernatural. That's insufficient. It's the wrong word. It's I suppose I could come up with some term, but it's not the term we need, it's the experience, right? So the ceremonial songs of ancient peoples and the ceremonial traditions of ancient peoples are one of the places that we can find inspiration and intelligence to pursue the explorations that will help us to recover the faculties that are natural to our waking consciousness and yet inhibited by it, and are the likely produce of something that resembles the opposite of lucid dreaming. And that opposite is not lucid waking. Again, we're missing language here, and I'll need to invent a neologism, a new word, for what I mean. But what I mean is the intrusion of the dreaming consciousness, the meaningful intrusion, the coherent intrusion of the dreaming consciousness into our waking world experience without collapsing it into a dream. And ceremony is authentic ceremony is one of the techniques with which we can produce such transformations, yeah, and explore them. And these techniques also will generally deeply affect our dreaming mind. And again, this is something thankfully I've had direct experience of. So, space is not the final frontier. Awareness is the fundamental frontier, and that will never change. And I suspect that there are forms of awareness that would allow us to explore space without the need for vehicles, and to explore, of course space is time, but to explore space-time and to participate in non-local temporality and space-time, both with the faculties implicit in our own human nature, but also those available by relationship with other intelligences of kinds I cannot name, for we have no language for them. And yet, I know them to exist, and they don't merely exist far away, they exist near at hand, hidden from our ordinary awareness in the ecologies, the insects, the animals, the plants, the microbes with which we are surrounded and of which we are composed. a profound adventure awaits those of us willing to participate in this exploration. And it's not without its dangers, but in my mind, in my view, the dangers of the catastrophically narrow and nearly uninhabitable consciousness most of us experience while awake and working at jobs and so on and so forth, that's a far more dangerous thing and produces endless catastrophes of result. Our modern societies are soul toxic. They are soul killing. And we must, I believe, recover the hope of something that nourishes our interiority. It's very loud hawk. I'm going to pause for a moment. We need to have experiences, authentic experiences, trustworthy, coherent experiences that nourish our interiority and that refresh and revitalize our dreaming. No one's going to do that for us. We're going to have to do that with and for each other together. We're going to have to do that for ourselves. And it takes some courage and some passion and some curiosity, but the dreaming mind is made of those. So it will naturally be attracted to these tasks. And one of the dangers is that the waking mind loves narratives, right? It loves models and explanations. It wants things it can grasp and manipulate. And it can become very domineering in this sense, so that we are prone to keep developing theories, right? That is not what I'm after at all. In fact, that's the opposite of what I hope for. And that would be that's one of the real dangers of this kind of activity, is that the waking mind just prefers stuff it can hold on to and grab onto and manipulate. So it loves theories and narratives and descriptions and so on and so forth. That's not what we need. We don't need theories of dreaming. We need the return of the faculties that underlie dreaming, and the faculties that our dreaming aspect can resurrect in our waking awareness, consciousness, and experience. Yeah. So we should be cautious about theory formation. We should be cautious about narratives. We should be cautious about explanations. We see so much of this kind of produce in our culture, in the media that surrounds the topics that we have gathered together under the rubric of the paranormal, right? Endless theories and models and stories and narratives and so on and so forth. The same kind of thing, conspiracy theory is the same, is another domain where narratives and concepts and models prevail. And I want us to be very cautious about that kind of thing in our explorations and our attempt to recover some of the faculties that I've here spoken about. I think there was in my mind a few moments ago. By the way, the attempt to remember something, I think is related somehow to dreaming. And our experiences of meaning and of understanding, what we call understanding, which is to translate just tokens into something meaningful that we can relate with, those faculties also seem to me to depend upon something very similar to dreaming. And when we use the word imagination, what we're referring to, again, seems deeply related to the dreaming faculties. Now, what was it? seem to have something to do with people talking about dreaming or remembering dreams. I'm sure that as soon as I stop making this video, I will recall it. It would be great if I could pause, but I don't think we've got that feature. I'm gonna check something really quick here. I'll be right back. Some people have spoken about the idea that our waking experience is actually a kind of dreaming, a subset of dreaming that we are trained to do so that we're not seeing what's actually here. We're dwelling in a kind of group-imposed representation. This model, and I have just cautioned us about models and narratives, this model has been popularized by the writings of Carlos Castaneda, a spectacular liar who nonetheless communicates information that can be very useful. That's my perspective on Castaneda's work. So in that view, and it's a view that I have some resonance with, some harmony with, our waking world experience is being composed by faculties that could be used for other astonishing things, including peculiar forms of travel. And this is one of the things that I haven't touched on yet, that I intended to. Some forms of dreaming, or of, remember I've said that there are thousands of faculties, and we're familiar with a very small portion of these. Some forms of dreaming allow us to experience travel of unusual kinds. And again, travel is too narrow an idea, because it's not as if our physical body necessarily travels to another place, and yet it is possible for an aspect of us to be transported to another place or time or situation, to be with other minds, while our body is unconscious. And perhaps even to take on other forms, right? Non-human forms. So there are a vast array of possible faculties. Now, some might be inclined to argue, well, you don't really take on another form, you just have some experience in your mind. But I think those perspectives are naive. They are materialistically naive. They are naive in the same way that staunch materialism is naive. Of course, everyone's entitled to their own perspective. I'm not trying to tell anyone what to think or believe. What I'm trying to do is present us with an array of perspectives that will empower us to begin the explorations and discoveries that I think will transform our ideas and capabilities as human beings dramatically, and that will return to us some of the incredible diversity of potential experience, opportunity, relation that has so long been buried under our representational overlays. There are many things that can assist us in these explorations. Authentic transmission of ceremonies from peoples whose cultures are thousands of years older than ours. Deep attention to living places and the relationships in them. Participation in those relationships, meaningful participation. We're living in a world that has been conceptually stripped of more than 90% of what's actually accessible and going on here. I'm hoping we could return even 10% of that to our direct, accessible, volitional experience. And that's an achievable goal in my view. It's achievable in the lifetime of a single human being. And such human beings, particularly if they're cautious about forming narratives and explanations, can produce astonishing results in those people they can assist in discovery and learning what they have discovered and learned, in transmission of those skills and faculties. In indigenous cultures, there is a tradition called transfer, and this is a ceremony whereby once again, the language, we don't have the language to encompass it. I'll try. It's a ceremony whereby non-ordinary relationships and faculties and skills and opportunities and protections can be shared from a group or a person, an individual, to another group or person. And these ceremonies are not like those we are used to in the West. They may appear superficially simplistic. That's the result of the iceberg effect, to put it mildly. What we will see on the surface is extremely modest compared to what is actually occurring during one of these ceremonies. And I feel very grateful to have ever experienced even one in my lifetime. It is inexplicable, thankfully inexplicable. And it's also the kind of thing that there are many aspects of our human experience and even our interiority that not only resist discussion, they should not be sullied by being spoken of. In the face of the awe and authentic reverence that we may have during such experience, we must remain silent. They do not belong to culture. They belong to something we have no name for, or that we have names for, but these names are too value-laden to be accurate. There are aspects of our interiority and what we can share together that must properly remain unverbalized, that we should not make concepts or models or narratives about, and even that we should not speak of, or very much resist the urge to speak of, or speak of only very subtly or refer to only indirectly. And this is part of the mystery of the non-ordinary aspects of our humanity and our interiority that have been lost. For in our time, we seem to think everything is fodder for vocalization. So I'd just like to caution that not everything should be spoken of. And I too am still learning about this. This is still new to me. And I'm so fascinated and excited by the opportunity to speak about these matters that I may be incautious and speak of things, well, and just speak of these kinds of things when they should not necessarily all be spoken of. I'll take the risk for the moment, while still acknowledging that some things are too profound and, in a sense, too holy to be subjected to our waking representational verbal consciousness. In fact, we might benefit from having the opposite happen. We might benefit from having our waking verbal conceptual consciousness subjected to that which is beyond its scope, is divine, is ecstatic, is holy, is sacred, is fundamentally beautiful and true. And by these words, I do not indicate narratives and concepts, but direct experienceable relationships. Thank you for joining me on this exploration, one that I am sure will continue. It's funny, almost every time I make a video, shortly thereafter, I've 5 or 6 or 10 or 15 things will come into my mind, which I suddenly realize, oh, I had forgotten, I should have spoken about this or that, and so on and so forth. So I'm sure we will continue to explore together, and I welcome your questions, comments, thoughts, perspectives, speculations, and the opportunity to explore together. So just as I expected, shortly after finishing the video, I remembered something I wanted to include. The thing that I had forgotten about, which is that when we're awake and we speak about dreaming, as I've been doing for, an hour and a half now, what I refer to as our dreaming mind, and I think of it as a number of other selves, right? Not just as a secondary self, but as a number of other aspects of who I am, who I can be, my identity, right? The dreaming aspects of our consciousness, when we speak of them, they listen, they wake up. And when we do the things that invoke them, they pay attention, they get very excited. Because I think our dreaming mind is really fascinated by what happens across the gap in the world of waking, where when it comes to that transformation, essentially it undergoes something like death, right? So I think our dreaming mind is extremely curious about what happens In the same way our waking mind is curious about what happens across the gap of dreaming, our dreaming mind is fascinated and deeply curious about, why do I collapse every morning? Why do I disappear every morning? What do I disappear into? Who's that guy who takes over and runs the ship on the other side? Or who's that gal, however we want to think about it. Who takes over? Like, what is that thing that causes me to be evicted from the vehicle? And of course, these are analogies. But the dreaming mind has its own kinds of memory and curiosity and passion and desire. And it pays attention when we're paying attention to it, particularly in the waking world. It's as if these other aspects of myself can hear me. And they awaken and become very attentive when we speak, particularly when we speak with reverence and respect and curiosity and wonder about the world of dreaming. So one of the ways that we can bridge that gap between these two worlds, and it's a very sophisticated array of differences and gaps, is by speaking meaningfully about it together. In many ancient cultures, the morning time was often spent sharing dreams. And some people today still have this habit, which I think is wonderful, although many people find nothing more they find it extremely tedious and do not want to hear about other people's dreams at all. Sharing about dreams, sharing dreams, speaking about dreams, exploring dreaming together while we're awake is one of the profound ways that we can catalyze the processes of awakening and discovery that I've been speaking about. And as I've said, the dreaming mind listens when we speak about it while we're awake. It also pays attention when we pay attention, right? If we record, if we do what we call recording our dreams, which really is recording the skeletal remains of a dream, the plot, then the dreaming mind notices that we're doing that when we're awake. And if we practice remembering our dreams, we will improve the faculties involved in dream memory. And these things are very important to be aware of. It is as if there are other selves that exist only when we are dreaming, and they want to understand, they want to know what is the other world that lies across that gap, and why do I disappear when the morning comes? What happens to me? What happens to the mind that I was dwelling as, right? So in the same way, our waking consciousness disappears and then transforms into dreaming. When we awaken, our dreaming consciousness tends to disappear and then transform into the waking version, the waking shape. And it's very curious about this other world over here, in which we think, in which identities are dependable, continuous, contiguous, in which locations don't transform, in which aspects of identity are lost or flattened, explained. So this is something that's very important to understand. The dreaming mind is curious about the waking world in a way not dissimilar to how our waking mind can become very curious about the dreaming world. And it listens when we speak about it. As if there's only one it, there may be they. Maybe they listen when we speak about them. These aspects of consciousness. And they are sensitive to our reverence, our curiosity, our passion. If we honor them, they pay attention. Yeah. If we pretend they are of no account, they pay attention. And also, we can speak to our dreaming mind from our waking consciousness in a number of ways. One of those I've been demonstrating by just talking about dreaming now while I'm awake. But when we lie down to go to sleep or to take a nap or whatever we're doing, or to have a visionary moment, we can speak to our dreaming mind within our body. And there are many different ways of doing this, and some of them might be nonverbal. We might draw pictures about, while thinking of what we desire, we might draw pictures while we're awake. Or we might dance, or we might sing. But we can also speak. And if we are to speak to the dreaming mind, it's been my experience that what works best, at least for me, is to move my consciousness, the felt sense of its location, to move that down from my head deep into my belly. Yeah. Deep, deep, not just into the root of the belly, but deep inside, right? And to speak from that place in the belly. I believe that our internal organs are deeply involved in dreaming. It's not merely a phenomenon that's happening in the brain. Blood flow is changing, or organ function is changing, metabolism is changing throughout the body. And for some reason, my dreaming mind seems to be especially responsive if I speak with it from deep within my belly. So that's one. These are a couple of things that I wanted to add to the video this afternoon. I'm sure other things will occur to me once I'm finished here, but I'm just grateful to be able to include them in the video today. And I'm not sure how I'm going to plug this in. Maybe I'll append it at the end, and that's the most likely thing. So once again, thank you for joining me, and I hope your dreams open up and flower and are astonishing and rich and beautiful and evocative and transformative and educational, just as the nature of dreaming itself always is. Thank you.